All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We're glad to have you here for this morning panel on why economic freedom was important to the rise of America and why it still matters today. My name is Will Ruger. I'm the president of the American Institute for Economic Research up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And I'm very pleased to have two and a half of my colleagues here today. I'll start with Sam Gregg, all the way to the right. Sam Gregg is an affiliate scholar at the Acton Institute and serves as the Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research. He has a D.Phil in Moral Philosophy and Political Economy from Oxford University and an M.A. in Political Philosophy from the University of Melbourne, and an all-around great colleague of ours. Tom Savidge, to his left, is a research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. He earned his master's in public policy from George Mason University and his Bachelor of Arts in political science and philosophy from SUNY New Paltz. And then to his left is Mike Munger. Many of you may know him from Duke University, where he's the professor of political science and director of the amazing PPE certificate program there. Sorry. His primary research focuses on the functioning of markets, regulation, and government institutions. He's taught at a number of different universities, including one in eastern Vermont called Dartmouth College, the University of Texas, and the University of North Carolina, as well as working as a staff economist at the FTC during the Reagan administration. So thank you all of you for joining us. And why don't we get started here? So, our panel is going to talk about both history and contemporary issues. And so I'm going to start with Sam to talk a little bit about history, which is how important was economic liberty in the period leading up to the American Revolution and afterwards? I mean, there were a lot of big questions on the table at that time. Can you talk a little bit about that and really explore how economic liberty was so important at the time?
Well, thanks, Will. I just might begin by saying I'm very glad to be here at ISI. This is my first time ever at ISI. I've never been in this building or the other one before, so this is a new experience for me. So the question concerning economic liberty and the American Revolution is extremely important. It's obviously the case that different types of freedoms were at stake and were debated about at the time leading up to and before the American and during the American Revolution. But I recently reread the first volume of the Oxford History of the United States, and the first volume is called The Glorious Cause, and it's all about the events leading up to the American Revolution and ends with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And one of the things that the author makes very clear right at the very beginning is that if you want to understand the American Revolution, there's a lot of different issues going on, but one thing that's a heavy economic weight in the background is what was called, or what Adam Smith famously labeled, the mercantile system. The mercantile system. And the mercantile system, I sometimes like to think we live in a rather mercantile system, actually. But this is the dominant economic system of the 18th century. It's a system in which some of the notions that Adam Smith promoted in The Wealth of Nations are still relatively unknown. It's a system in which the government actually plays a significant and large role in the economy. It's a system which runs on patronage and what we would call cronyism and corruption. And it was also very much integral to the way that the British fiscal military state operated. So if you go back to the 7 Years' War, and Britain, of course, emerges as the great victor over France and Spain, and emerges really as the world's first global superpower. And this fiscal military state is based upon a very large national debt, which has to be funded, and there's this expectation that if you're in the British Empire, if you want part of the colonies, that's essentially where that's how you trade, that's where you trade, these are the people that you trade with, and you're not really supposed to go outside those barriers. And part of the deal of this is that Britain provides naval support, protection, etc., for American colonists who want to trade between each other as well as the rest of the world. Now, as the American colonies became richer and wealthier, the downsides of the mercantile system started to become more and more apparent because American colonists wanted to trade with other people besides those who lived in the American colonies, and this was not something that London particularly appreciated. So if you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, some of you will know that it ends with a whole discourse about why Adam Smith thinks that in the end, the costs of the mercantile system, and he's writing in 1776, so this is just after the revolution has started, why he says the costs of the mercantile system are such to American colonists that at some point, Britain is either going to have to face up to the full costs of maintaining this empire and this particular type of economic system, or it should just let the colonies go. And I think it's pretty clear what Adam Smith thought was the appropriate response. So the mercantile system produced enormous tensions between American colonies and London. So that's one big thing that's going on in the background. You can't understand things like the Boston Tea Party. You can't understand the outrage of American colonists when they were told, you must buy tea from the East India Company. You may not buy tea from anywhere else. You may not import it from anywhere else. That's how the mercantile system operated. So that's one set of economic issues that I think is very important for the American Revolution. This American effective rebellion against the mercantile system, which for people like Adam Smith was something that was, to his mind, not unexpected, and he's in some respects only surprised it hadn't happened earlier. So that's one thing. A second thing, of course, is property. Issues about property, debates about property and taxation and representation. Those of you who are historians of this particular period will know that as a consequence of the enormous debt that Britain had acquired as a consequence of winning the 7 Years' War, it needed to pay for that debt. It also needed to pay for lots of British soldiers being stationed in North America, guarding the frontier with the Native American tribes. And that, of course, raised questions about whether the American colonists should be paying for this. And the American colonists were saying, well, it's not that we object to paying for this, it's just that you don't have the authority to ask us to pay for this. Because then you see how issues about property, about taxation, immediately had impact upon the relationship between what the British would call the king in Parliament, and where they thought sovereignty was located, and the political status of each of the American colonies. So you see there's an immediate economic issue that's at stake that automatically flows over into questions about property. And property is always much more than just about economics. Property concerns deeper questions of liberty. So you can see here how economics starts to affect the political debates that were going on at the time about Britain's relationship with the rest of its empire.
Yeah, so Sam, let's kind of go a little bit further in American history up through the 19th century. And we hear a lot about how essentially a kind of tariff regime was critical to America's industrialization and economic wealth. Tell us why that story is problematic, why that's flawed.
In fact, Tyler Cowen in the Bloomberg today has a whole article about this topic. There was an article that came out written by, it's in the National Bureau of Economic Research, that came out, I think, last week, looking at this question of the relationship between tariffs and what we might call the Gilded Age, when America really took off, economically speaking, and became what is a global economic power. And this article, there's a lot of math in it. I won't bore you with that. But what it does show is that things like tariffs actually affected negatively things like productivity. It facilitated a lot of cronyism. It didn't actually play much of a role at all in terms of the takeoff of the American economy in the second half of the 19th century. But this is not new. This is not a new piece of information. you only need to read Douglas Irwin. Someone mentioned Dartmouth before. Douglas Irwin and his mammoth 800-page thriller, Clashing Over Commerce, which is basically a history of trade in the United States. And he shows very clearly that if you want to understand the takeoff of the United States in the second half of the 19th century, what is it? Well, it's dynamic capital markets. It's a pretty strong rule of law regime. Property rights were very much respected at this particular period of time. There was also a lot of immigration. A lot of immigrants came to the United States in that period of time and brought a lot of human capital with them as well. And he's not the only person. He says that if you look at the way that the particular industries that were protected by tariffs, they underperformed vis-a-vis those industries that were not protected by tariffs. But Irwin's not the only person to note this. In the 19th century, one of the premier economic historians of the time was a progressive, actually, who taught at, I think it was Harvard or Princeton, probably Princeton, Frank Tausig, and he wrote A Tariff History of the United States, which was published in 1888. And he sort of did what we would call empirical work on this question, and he found very clearly that there was really no positive effects flowing from the tariff. There were a lot of negative effects flowing from the tariffs, and the primary one that he identified as hugely problematic was the sheer degree of cronyism. He said, if you look behind every tariff, there is a special interest.
Right.
And I think that's still true today.
I'm going to flip the script a little bit, Tom, because I think this segues nice into maybe what Mike will talk about here. So one of the challenges I think that's identified today to our economic prosperity is the role that bureaucracy, regulation, how that stymies American innovation that in the period Sam was talking about was so important. I mean, can you talk a little bit? I mean, you're an expert in public choice theory. Could you talk a little bit about the role of bureaucracy and the challenges it poses and why we need to, and I think that President-elect Trump talked about this the other night, why need to kind of embrace or unleash innovation?
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I'm a senior fellow at AIER, and it is a relationship that is very valuable to me, so I'm glad to be a part of this panel. It is very helpful to follow Sam. I wanted to skip all the way to the present and read to you. We actually have a department, in a main department that has a secretary in the U.S. government called the Department of Commerce. Now, that's actually quite remarkable. We have a bureaucracy that is in charge of commerce. And I wanted to read something from this is their own words. I'm not making this up. The Department of Commerce's mission is to create conditions for economic growth and opportunity for all communities. The department fosters the innovation and invention that underpin the U.S. comparative advantage. Its scientists research emerging technologies such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence. So this is the scientists employed by the Department of Commerce that are making these important discoveries. The department serves as the voice of business in the federal government, so we have bureaucrats representing business, and at the same time, the department touches and serves every American every day. I didn't ask to be touched. This is honestly non-consensual touching. I'm surprised that, and what I worry about is that the new administration will be confused about the nature of bureaucracy. It is true that until now, I have been touched apparently every day without knowing it by a hand that was wearing a blue latex glove.
Visible hand.
The hand. I don't want to be touched by a hand wearing a red latex glove either. The question is not who should control the bureaucracy. The question is, how can we have less of it? So market processes are a process of discovery that uses price to collect information that is possessed by no one, that tells us something about the relative values of resources and directs those resources towards their highest valued uses. Now, there are problems with that. There's externalities, there's concentrated corporate power, there are difficulties with markets. But the only alternative at the state level is bureaucracy. Now, I think we should recognize there is a third really important sector, what Richard Cornell called the independent sector, what Alexis de Tocqueville called voluntary private associations, churches, clubs, all of those things can also organize activity. But if the first question you have is, what should we do? You've already lost. Why do you think there's a we on this question? The American tradition is you and you and you and you and you do what you think is right. If we say, what will we do, then we're going to appoint a commission or a bureaucracy that's going to touch us. So we have a Department of Education. It's probably literally unconstitutional in the sense that this is a state activity. We have a Department of Commerce whose job it is to be a bureaucracy that's in charge of private enterprise. It's logically impossible. So the difficulty that I have is that many of us on the right, many of us who are in favor, on paper at least, of voluntary private organizations and decentralized private action, nonetheless are seduced by the siren song of bureaucratic power. Now, Ludwig von Mises famously said, you have to recognize you can't, in his book, Bureaucracy, almost a century ago, you cannot reform bureaucracy. And I'm terrified by the fact that this administration is already talking about they're going to appoint a committee to make bureaucracy more efficient. That's nonsense on stilts. What you need to do is get rid of the bureaucracy. We need to get rid of the Department of Education. We need to get rid of the Department of Commerce. Bureaucracy is inherently that mechanism that the territorially extensive state is required to use if they're going to manage things. And so the genius of the American founding was to create a separate domain in which the state was simply not welcome. We didn't need to be touched by the state because we're capable of taking care of these things ourselves. The difficulty that what I worry about is that we're going to forget the lessons of the founding and the clear lessons of public choice, Ludwig von Mises and the people who studied bureaucracy, and try to reform. But I find it no more attractive to be touched by a red-clothed glove than by a blue one.
Yeah, Mike, there was talk at the end of the campaign about Elon Musk playing a role. And what he did at Twitter, it seemed like, where he basically fired a whole bunch of people that didn't seem to have a job that made sense for the bottom line. What are the challenges that an Elon Musk or someone else like him would face in trying to do the same thing in the federal government?
We have a civil service system that prevents people from being fired for political reasons, and rightly so. I'm actually a fan of that. It is the nature of bureaucracy that you can only be removed for cause. And so if you look at, Mises basically concedes the claims that were made by Max Weber about the advantages of bureaucracy. The advantage of bureaucracy, you have people who are expert in the rules. So bureaucracies operate under an authority that is delegated to them by statute by the Congress. And then there's rulemaking, there's promulgation, there's a process that gets outside comment. That's actually the way the bureaucracy has to work. So I don't think the problem is that bureaucracy is inefficient. A comic famously said someone on stage was bitten by a tiger and people had said the tiger went nuts. No, the tiger went tiger. That's what tigers do. What bureaucracies do is follow the rules in this slow, cumbersome way. So firing a bunch of people is not going to help. We still have to enforce the rules. It's getting rid of the rules. And Elon Musk can't do that. Only Congress can. And I don't see any appetite in Congress for doing that. You always hear Ronald Reagan, we're going to get rid of the Department of Education. It was larger and had more employees in 88 than it did in 80. So we are terrible at actually following through on this. You have to recognize that getting rid of bureaucrats at the IRS, we still have the tax laws. They still have to be enforced. If you want to solve that problem, simplify the tax code. Getting rid of the IRS is not going to help. So there's a misunderstanding about what bureaucracies do. And it was actually the appointment, I didn't want to say, but it was the prospective appointment of Elon Musk as being the sort of high-level, very visible balloon juice that politicians use instead of actual substantive reform.
So how can we get substantive reform? I mean, do we just need to have a political cultural change in the country, or do you think that there's any, I mean, I guess you already said there's no appetite on the Hill for it. So what do we need to do here?
If you grab a politician by his voters, he will follow. And so if we can appeal to voters to make people recognize, the worst thing to do would be an across-the-board cut of 10% of all agencies. So I follow Tyler Cowen a bit on saying, at least on this, what we want is government competence in the areas we want government to function. But there are whole domains where government should not be functioning. It's much easier to get rid of, and I'm going to keep saying this, the Department of Education and the Department of Commerce. Those two things should not exist. There are billions of dollars on the table from getting rid by statute of those two departments.
Right. So what I hear you saying is, for example, rather than try to reform the DEI bureaucracy, simply kill it. That's the only way you'll do it, because if you reform the DEI bureaucracy, you're simply going to make it potentially more efficient at doing what it shouldn't be doing in the first place.
That makes me sound heartless, as if I don't care about all the people who need to be touched by the Department of Commerce. But the rather than kill it, these are unconstitutional agencies that should never have existed in the first place. We should revert to the framework and the logic of the American founding and have government only function in its correct place. So all we're doing is restoring the status quo, not killing anything.
Yes. So, Tom, and you could see why we love having Mike writing at the Daily Economy, and I really recommend that you look at his regular columns here. Tom, and again, apologize for tossing this your way after what Mike said, but it seems like one thing that happens at the state level that it could have some hope here are things like sunrise and sunset laws. But tell us more generally why the states do a better job in many cases than the federal government at protecting economic freedom, or at least preventing the kind of bureaucratic growth that Mike talks about.
Well, I guess that's a difficult question, because the states can be a mixed bag. You get some really good instances. You say you get for every Utah, there's California, there's New York, there's Illinois. And to some extent, though, I will say that states have to be a little bit more accountable, because one, they don't have access to the money printer, and they have to finance things either through taxes or debt, which is really just taxes on future taxpayers, whether it's the future versions of ourselves or our children and grandchildren. And there's the fact, as Dr. Munger mentioned, if you grab a politician by their voters, they will listen. And what happens when voters start leaving their district? That doesn't bode well for them. People vote with their feet, as we've seen over the past 4 years. Even if you're not looking at the IRS data, U-Haul, United Van Line puts out moving summaries, and they tell you where are people getting the most trucks and where are people moving to. And I think I believe a one-way trip out of California on U-Haul costs double than what it is to get a round trip, bring the U-Haul, take it somewhere, and then bring it back to the California store. So I think back to your question, though, I think they have to be a bit more accountable, because the option to exit is much easier to do between states than it is for somebody to say pick up and totally leave the country.
Yeah. What do you think the record is on things like sunset laws, though, at making sure that some aspects of governance aren't necessarily permanent without the legislature weighing in again in some fashion?
Well, we are seeing some promise in places like Idaho, and I guess if you're looking at it from a policy perspective, sunset laws are great, regulatory audits are great, but there's no one silver bullet that's going to fix everything. You have to look at solutions as arrows in the quiver. And so if you're only focusing, say, on like a sunset law, you're ignoring other solutions at your own peril, like say particular fiscal rules like the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights in Colorado. And I think another point too, Dr. Munger, to the extent of why bureaucracy does what it does, where I'm reminded of William Niskaden's Peculiar Economics of Bureaucracy, where he talks about bureaucratic success. How is bureaucratic success measured? The number of people you have working under you and the size of your discretionary budget. And the only way to do those, to grow both of those things, is to invite mission creep. So not just that you're following the rule, they're following the rules. It's they're making new rules. They're trying to quote unquote look for new problems to solve. So I think regulatory sunsets, like I'd say in places like Idaho or places, states that are doing these regulatory audits, it's helping constrain the worst aspects of that desire for mission creep.
Yeah. So you mentioned public debt. Talk in particular about how public debt is a danger, a threat to economic freedom and all the good things that economic freedom unleashes.
Yeah, so that, as I mentioned earlier, public debt is really just, future taxes on future taxpayers. And that was an insight that comes from James Buchanan, where he looks at, who suffers if public spending is unwise. It's not the taxpayers right now because they get to enjoy the spending without the cost. It's not the bond investors because even though they're sacrificing a little bit of their income right now, they expect to be paid back with interest in the future. And it's not really then what it falls down to are taxpayers in the future. When that debt comes due, they're the ones that have to make a genuine sacrifice to their income to pay this debt. And when you're taking on debt to fund ridiculous government programs, wasteful spending, you're having a cost and you're not seeing any sort of benefit for the money there. And think about where that money could have gone had it stayed in your wallet. And that's a genuine cost to economic freedom because you're less richer. You have less money. You have less less ability to make your own choices because you're dedicating so much more of your own income to giving it to the government.
Yeah. Talk a little bit though about how. Or why isn't the argument that, well, these are just investments in future economic growth? Why is that a problematic argument when government makes that? Or is it a problematic argument? Should we be doing, for example, expanding debt forgiveness for students? Should we be, building, engaging in more industrial policy to support our economy in the future? Like, why are these investments, or are these creating opportunity costs, or the unseen costs?
It's definitely creating those opportunity costs, and because it's sort of touching on what you were saying, Sam, where behind these sorts of programs, there's always a special interest. Like you mentioned the student loan forgiveness, and it's like that's the huge transfer of wealth from the Americans who, many of whom didn't go to college to the Americans that chose to go to college. And I think that there's always that, that element of it's, even though they're saying it's an investment, there is a genuine opportunity cost there. And that we're talking about the next highest valued use of your money. And this comes really prominently when you have to file your income taxes. I had an income tax bill to pay this month, and when I was making that payment through TurboTax, I was thinking about all of the things I could have used that money for, and it stung. And so when you're thinking about it's the government taking on debt, there's always that opportunity cost, and it's sort of what you touched on before, Dr. Munger, where it's like you're looking at what sort of incentives do actors in the public sector have versus actors in the private sector? Private sector success is generally measured by profit. You're able to provide a good or service at a price people are willing to pay, and your revenues are exceed your costs. Whereas, if you're an elected official, your incentives are get elected, get reelected. Whatever priority number 3 is, as Thomas Sowell points out, is far behind the first 2. So you're not thinking about providing something that people are demanding. You're thinking about your own self-preservation, and the same thing with those unelected bureaucrats as well.
So I'm going to ask this of any of you to jump in, but I'm going to invite Sam first, which is, And it's sometimes an uncomfortable topic, I think, among friends. And I think that classical liberals, right of center leaning libertarians, liberty-friendly conservatives, in that family, if you will, I think that there's been a concern about how conservatives are losing faith in freedom and free markets. So, Sam, could you talk a little bit about why you think this is happening, and then why it's a bad idea for us to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to some of the concerns that people might have about a free society? And I invite the rest of you to jump in if you'd like on this.
So I would argue that really since the progressive era, there have been plenty of intellectuals on the left who have argued for, and been quite successful actually, in seeing a lot more intervention into the economy than could ever have been contemplated, certainly by the founders, to an extent that I think that they would find simply incomprehensible. So to a certain extent, we've become used to a lot of intervention in the economy. We've become accustomed to it. We are much more like just another European social democracy in managed decline than I think people realize. If you look at some of the indicators that Tom was talking about, they're very much present. But one of the things is when you become used to something, seeing it removed or taken away or reduced or questioned, there are some conservatives who will get nervous about that. So that's one thing. I think it's a sort of instinctive conservative response is, why change? Even if the change is away from something that you can show is very bad, like big welfare states, there are some people who on the right who will instinctively get nervous about that. So that's one thing. I think another thing that's going on is that clearly America has lots of deep-set social and cultural problems. Whether it's things like male participation in the workforce, whether it's the number of Americans that receive some form of entitlement spending, whether it's the breakdown of marriage, the decline of religious participation. We could go on and on and on and identify all sorts of deep social pathologies in the United States. And I think it's foolish to deny those things are real. I think some libertarians tend to just not care about that stuff, which I think is a serious problem. But one thing I think that some conservatives have fallen into the trap of doing is saying, well, this is driven by the economy. This is primarily a type of economic problem. And therefore, that's why we need an industrial policy, or that's why we need tariffs. Well, a tariff is not going to fix family breakdown. Industrial policy is not going to somehow magically revive a particular state or region of the country. In fact, I would argue would do a lot of damage to those parts of the country that you're concerned about. So I worry about the tendency of some conservatives to, ironically enough, have a quite economistic explanation for social and cultural phenomena that had, in my view, very little to do with the economy. So if you take things like the breakdown of marriage and the rise of divorce and the number of out-of-wedlock children, etc., I think that's got a lot more to do with the disasters of the 1960s cultural revolutions than it's got anything to do with the economy per se, which means that you need cultural and social solutions to those types of problems. And the other part of the problem there is, of course, that many of the institutions that used to be able to deal with some of those problems are not don't have the same type of impact or same type of authority that they once did. I'm a Catholic, I'm a practicing Catholic, and I look at the Catholic Church in America and it says no moral authority whatsoever because of sex scandals and financial scandals. Who cares what the bishops think, frankly, about all sorts of things? I think that's an example of an institution that used to provide a great deal of moral capital and cultural ballast to society that has, in many respects, damaged itself so much that it's not taken seriously when it comes to talking about some of these problems. And again, that's not going to be fixed by raising taxes or embracing corporatism or increasing regulation or even things like family supplements. It's not going to change those dynamics. So ironically, I think one of the challenges for Those of us who have a culturally conservative view of the world is to think about, well, if these things are real and if the causes are not primarily economic, how do we fix these social and cultural institutions? And guess what? That's really hard work.
Tom, Mike?
Would you like to go for it? Thank you. Yeah, actually, it's funny. You brought up the cultural revolutions of the 60s, and I kind of want to offer a little bit of a maybe friendly pushback and say, I think the rise of the welfare state you could point to having, some influence. So I guess you could say it's somewhat economic on the breakdown of the family. Particularly, it's even somebody, it was funny because even in the early critiques of the Great Society programs, which Medicare and Medicaid turn 60 next year, and that, I remember reading, in undergrad that even somebody like Bobby Kennedy said, well, wait a second, you're giving higher payouts to single parent families. Is that going to incentivize more single parent families? And then too, I think there, in a lot of the cultural shift too, the dependence on things like entitlement programs or, any sort of federal transfers, you always look at it, there's always strings attached and there's always terms and conditions that you have to follow. And that certainly influences the culture as well. But I'd be interested in hearing, what you think about that and from that angle.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at something like, I mentioned male participation in the workforce between the ages of 18 and 35.
Yep.
When does that start taking off? Does anyone know? It starts off when the Great Society programs are implemented. So I actually agree with you. I do think that things like these types of interventions can send very negative signals to people about what they should do, whether they should work, how they should work, etc. In fact, if you look at the male participation rate in the workforce, it's just gone up and up and up and up and up, and it has never gone down. And I do think that the fact that it's relatively easy to access welfare at both the federal and state level and put together enough different things, it's actually affordable for someone to live in their basement and play video games all day, right? So, yeah, no, I do think that economics certainly does, in the economy, does have incentivized people to behave in certain ways. All I'm questioning is attributing these things to just purely economic causes and then expecting that a type of intervention is going to switch things around, I think is misright.
Mike?
I worry that we have asked government to be responsible for things it can't possibly be. There's this all-encompassing gauzy protection from all risk. And we see this even at universities, and a lot of you probably read, and I did a little checking, and it was true. The public policy school at Georgetown, to make sure that students the day after the election were not too upset, had a room where, seriously, there were Legos and cookies and hot chocolate and stuffed animals where they could go and grieve over the outcome of the election. Metaphorically, that's what government tries to do for all of us. We're protected from all risks. That's literally impossible. And I guess it makes me think of the fact that we never try to update this model. So imagine that it's 1820. Your daughter has a fever. You call the doctor. The doctor takes a very sharp but somewhat rusty and not sanitary razor blade out and makes a small incision in her wrist and takes half a pint of blood. Her fever continues. He takes another half pint of blood. She's not getting better. He takes another half pint of blood. She dies. He concludes he didn't take enough blood. That's the wrong conclusion. The entire model is wrong. The very idea that the state should be protecting us from the risks of everyday life is not, we can't solve that by, it didn't work yet, we have to spend more money. But that's the loop we're trapped in. I worry that we have some of the same problem in foreign policy. So I had a student at Dartmouth, his name was John Pelson, recently wrote a very interesting book called Wireless Wars. And in it, he did a lot of interviews with me. And I will admit that there may be settings where there are risks that my sort of, free trade is always good, doesn't operate very well on. So if I'm a liberal, you're a liberal, and relative gains don't matter because both of us are better off by any voluntary exchange, that's great. But what about Huawei? Should we be buying 5G, having throughout our infrastructure this Chinese technology that very likely has some sort of backdoor that is a threat to our security? And if one of you is a liberal and the other is trying to establish itself as a world power that wants to be stronger than you, it would be like, because I go and I say, you need to realize that free trade benefits both countries. Relative gains don't matter. So imagine that it is June 4th, 1944, and I go to General Eisenhower, and I say, look, if we invade France, it's going to harm both countries. You ought to not do that. And he says, well, yes, but we're going to inflict more harm on the Germans than we will on ourselves. No, relative gains don't matter. Well, in war, relative gains do matter. And if China thinks we're at war and we think we're a liberal society, it may be that by playing different games, my arguments about free trade are not going to be very persuasive. So those of us who want to argue for free trade need to recognize that national security concerns also matter. And by refusing to allow those two to be connected, I think the people in charge that are trying to argue for free trade have lost a lot of credibility because we're just deaf to the potential problems of national security. And I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
I mean, you're singing from the same sheet. And in fact, I would highly recommend looking at Sam's white paper, the first in our new white paper series at aier.org, in which he actually explicitly looks at the connection between trade and national security, because I think there are two really key questions when it comes to trade, among a lot of questions, I'm sure others, but two really important ones, which is Mike's one about national security concerns. And then the second one is something that when we were at the Mont Pelerin Society meetings in India recently was raised by one of the questioners during the Q&A of my session, which is what type of answer can we give to people who say that changing the trade regime leads to some people being harmed? How do we deal with those who are being harmed? Now, the simple answer could be something like, well, on net, this is going to be an advantage to the United States, so let's just do that. Or they were benefiting from a regime that was unnatural in the sense of not being free market, and therefore they have no right to make a claim that what was going on before that they prospered under, that they should be rectified when they lose. Neither of those two answers, I think, works very well.
We could have a room with cookies and Legos.
Right. So the challenge for us, I think, is to handle these questions. And they're both difficult ones because most of the government solutions to the losers don't work. Training programs, for example, are going to be as effective probably as those Legos at helping, kind of people get over their challenges. So I think these are really critical issues we have to ask. And again, Adam Smith, the kind of patron saint, if you will, of free markets, would not have, I think, reacted in a hostile way to what Mike just said. He understood that security issues came prior to issues of opulence, right? Of economics. That being said, you have to be very careful that you don't allow cronyism to enter in through the back door of a national security argument. And that's unfortunately what happens so often, is that people are making an argument for, well, we can't allow China to dominate the Lego market, for example. Like, who cares, right? Now, again, you could make a bigger, larger argument about relative economic gains, but the fact is that the United States has generally benefited from a trade regime that's relatively free, that protects national security and deals with things like IP and tech theft. And I think those are some of the areas, and I know libertarians argue about whether IP even exists, but a lot of us do. And I think IP issues, tech theft, and national security are some of the big challenges. Sam, you didn't talk about how important moral foundations are to a healthy economy. I was surprised by that, especially given that you've talked a lot about this in your career. So I think it was more that you just were talking about something else rather than talking about that. So maybe you could expound upon why people who care about free markets, like all of us do on stage. I mean, my institution, AIER, is dedicated to individual liberty, to economic freedom, to property rights, sound money, limited government. But we also care about, or we also need to think about, what are the cultural requirements of a thriving economy? Because I don't think it's the case that markets will function without certain foundations. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I have an article, a co-authored article coming out in National Affairs this month or next month, that half of which is devoted specifically to this question. And I've spent a lot of my life writing about this precise issue. So let me just quickly say a couple of things. One is utility and utilitarianism doesn't do it. It's not a sufficient, well, I think utilitarianism is an inherently incoherent moral way of thinking about the world anyway. But it seems to me that without certain norms being in place, markets find it very difficult to function. It was, I think, Hayek who said something like, it's in the Constitution of Liberty, I believe. He says, a free society is paradoxically enough likely to be a very traditional society, which is a very Burkean insight into how a free society as a whole, but also how an economy needs to work more generally. Because without these norms in place, whether they're expressed through tradition, whether they're expressed through custom, whether they're expressed through different forms of association, whether they are expounded and taught particularly by families and civil society institutions, government is not particularly good at doing that. It's very lousy at doing that generally for the most part. But these sorts of things need to be in place. So if you don't have basic norms of honesty, if there isn't an understanding that stealing is intrinsically wrong in every single case, if you don't understand that the case for private property is not just about how it's useful, but the way that it creates a sphere of freedom and autonomy for individuals and families, if you don't understand that virtues are real and that you need to live in a virtuous way if you want to live in a civilized society, the type of society that you want a market to function in, if you don't understand that, then I think you don't have much of a case for building up a strong argument for why you prefer markets as opposed to other types of economic systems. And an older generation of classical liberal thinkers understood this. So I don't need to tell this audience that it's really worth reading Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, right? And one of the things that Smith did to his favorite book was that he revised something like 6 times in his life. And right at the end of his life, he added a whole section on the virtues. He talks about commercial virtues. He talks about the classical virtues, i.e. Greece and Rome. But he also talks about what he calls virtues of benevolence. And he's really talking about religious virtues there. I think that's very clear. And he's very insistent that these are the types of things that you need in place if you want a functioning commercial society to operate. I think that classical liberal thinkers, certainly up until the 1960s, had a much deeper and more attentive view of these things than, frankly, a lot of free market thinkers today. And one of the things we do at AIER is talk about these all the time. Professor Munger recently had a piece in the Daily Economy talking precisely about, I think you would describe it as the failure of libertarians to deal with these sorts of issues in any way that, with any degree of seriousness, which I think is a very, right, yeah. Exactly. So, yes, we need more free market inclined thinkers engaging those types of questions. The good news is that there's a whole tradition of this, which is very rich and very real, but needs to be brought together to the present.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Frank Meyer, who wanted to bring together the importance of freedom and virtue. And I think that while it's really important what you say, that libertarians, classic liberals need to, I think, recapture, if you will, or reemphasize the importance of certain values, I also think it's really important that conservatives, don't try to distance themselves from the importance of freedom as a mechanism for promoting our flourishing in the economic realm, but also, as Meyer talked about, as a way to actually allow for the possibility of true virtue, right? And I think that Meyer's argument with Bozell there, I think Meyer gets the best of Bozell on that. But Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit about your piece, or about why freedom is important too. It's not just enough to talk about virtue. And even though Sam's correct, those foundational values are important to the workings of an economy. But what about freedom?
Well, please forgive me, those of you who've heard this several times already, because I've done versions of this at Heritage and at PhillySoc recently, but there is sort of a mea culpa that I feel obliged to give, and it is, I would start with Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman famously said that when we're thinking about rules, we shouldn't make the mistake of saying all we need is good people. You can't rely on having good people. This is the Madisonian principle of we can't make sure that there's an enlightened helmsman running the state. That's fine as far as it goes. What Friedman said was that rather than relying on good people, we should have rules that make bad people act as if they were good. That's the basic sort of libertarian approach, and we say, and markets can do that, because markets mean that everyone acting in their own self-interest ends up redounding to the interest of all. So we invoke Adam Smith's invisible hand theorem, which actually Adam Smith never stated or meant. If you read the two books together, that's a gross exaggeration of Adam Smith. And in fact, the way that we should probably think of it, I've had a number of debates with Patrick Deneen, and in doing that, in his view of the failure of liberalism, I've come a long way in his direction. Because what Deneen said is that liberalism has come to be understood as the claim that anything that is not illegal is moral. We have a set of rules, and anything else is okay. That's not what liberalism means. I have berated him, but I've come to realize that he's not wrong. That is how liberalism is understood, and it's my fault if I may stand in for all libertarians and all public choice people. So I'm trying to take on the sins of all here. I'm not going to die to atone for them, but I will publicly say that I'm willing to take on those sins. We were never right about that. All of the process of markets requires that people have, along with autonomy, a sense of individual moral responsibility. And without that, the system won't really work. And we need other institutions to create that. Markets cannot, neither can government. So we need voluntary organizations. They can be churches, they can be Boy Scouts, they can be all sorts of other things operating in the background. So the difficulty that we have is that by not saying that a necessary condition for the functioning of markets is the moral education of a public where people understand the traditions of the past, the wisdom that has come down to us from the past, they revere that as a big part of their education. And then markets may flourish. But without that, markets actually make the problem worse. And I do think that the Meyer's, I didn't really, I think, understand Meyer's fusionism until the last couple of years. So Meyer's fusionism, well, I have said that there are two different atoms, that the two atoms are libertarianism and conservatism. And the problem is that these are unstable in their elemental form. Libertarians tend to become free radicals and just go off to their marijuana patch and their AR-15. And conservatives become authoritarian. The problem is that faith, to be salvatory, must be voluntary and authentic. It can't be forced. And so the difficulty that we have is that libertarianism needs conservatism in order to have a focus and a way to function, but conservatism needs a market setting for people to be able to act out the autonomy that actually constitutes a membership in a free society. It cannot be dictated. So only the element, the molecule of fusionism is capable of controlling these two otherwise unstable elements.
Yeah, I think that's a wise way of thinking. And importantly for, I think, it to work, there has to be both approbation for the good and disapprobation for those things that aren't consistent, I think, with a flourishing self or society. So how do we avoid, how on the one hand do we have a society where approbation is kind of works its own invisible hand mechanism? Without government, you can get social change in a positive direction, but at the same time, without it becoming kind of overbearing, overweening in the way that kind of wokeness has. I think there's a kind of difficulty there, right? So on the one hand, and I wrote this in a piece in Reason, of all places, on virtue libertarianism, talked about Bell Knox. Like, Bell Knox was a student at Duke University, and in order to avoid...
She was the head of the Libertarian Club. We often would have lunch. She was a staunch libertarian.
Right. But in order for her to bear the tragedy of having to go to NC State instead of Duke, she acted in porn movies. So on the one hand, we want to give disapprobation, and because if that's inconsistent with someone's flourishing, we don't want that to be considered a kind of proper way of conducting oneself. But at the same time, how do you not create a world in which we're asking people to wear scarlet letters and they're pushed out of society? How do we achieve that balance, do you think?
Oh boy,
I'm inclined to say read Thomas Aquinas. I think he gets it right. This is not a new problem, right? Because on the one hand, you don't want a society in which the mentality is, well, it's just all subjective preference. You just do what you want as long as you don't harm anyone else. That's fine. I'd cast no judgment on you. No, actually, we do need to make judgments about people's actions, not about their souls, but about their actions. That's part of it. We need to be willing to say, no, you're my friend, but I think that's seriously wrong. I don't think it's a good idea for someone to think, oh, prostitution is a good career path. We can disagree about whether we should actively use the law to stop people from doing that, but we shouldn't have any hesitation about saying, no, that's not a good career path. I don't care what your subjective preferences are here. So that's to regaining the confidence to be able to do that. And I think there's a lot of lack of confidence on the part of people, even in their own families, to do that. When parents are reluctant to discipline their children, to say to them, no, Johnny, that's wrong and it always will be wrong. There's no excuse for that. So having institutions, these civil society institutions that are willing to be tough moral taskmasters and forming people in character so it becomes second nature.
No, and look, again, in that piece I wrote, Jason Sorens and I were pretty hardcore on pushing that. But my question is more around, like, we've had this experience of cancel culture and wokeness from the left, in which they would argue they're just doing what we're just preaching. They just have a different kind of teleological, North Star. So how do we find that right path where we are giving disapprobation to push society in a certain direction, but without it becoming such a kind of just a right-wing version of what we've seen with cancel culture and intoleration? How do we avoid that? Again, I don't have an answer. That's why I'm asking smarter people like you guys, because I don't think that we would simply want to say that, like, we're going to fire anyone who has, committed a sin against the Burkean moral foundations. But at the same time, we obviously want to promote a better society. Tom?
So I guess it's like, I'm not sure how to what that particular balance looks like, but it's funny when we talk about freedom, we often talk about, the good stuff that comes out of it, the prosperity, we talk about the reward side, but I think another interesting point, and Hayek brings this up, and I remember reading this as an undergrad student 10 years ago, and it blew my mind, and it opened me up to these ideas about a free society. Hayek, in the Constitution of Liberty, this chapter 2 is called The Creative Powers of a Free Civilization. And he makes this contrast between a conscripted soldier and a vagabond. The conscripted soldier has everything provided for him. They tell him when to wake up, when to eat. He's got his whole day planned for him, but he has no freedom. The vagabond has complete freedom, but he doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from. And Hayek makes this point that freedom sometimes means the freedom to starve, the freedom to fail. So I think with the element of freedom, sometimes failure is the best teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, what that balance looks like, it's difficult to strike, but having that element of freedom there, the freedom, whether it is the freedom to criticize, the freedom to, the freedom to shame, sure, but there's also the freedom to say, well, maybe, this group might cancel you, go and take your ball and play somewhere else. That, there's that element of freedom as well.
Yeah. Mike.
Both James Buchanan and Friedrich Hayek were moved by exactly this question to write essays called Why I Am Not a Conservative and then Why I Too Am Not a Conservative in Buchanan's case. And the reason they wrote this was that their claim, perhaps wrong, but their claim was that conservatism was simply, as Buckley said, someone standing athwart history shouting stop. That is, the wisdom that has come down to us from the past is unquestionable. We can't question any of it. We can't change it. And both Hayek and Buchanan wanted to say in some areas we can do better. And so some of these things can be questioned. And for both of them, the North Star was liberalism. We will need to change traditions of the past in favor of combined responsibility and autonomy. But then the question is, under what circumstances do we get to use disapprobation as a sanction? And I think Adam Smith answers the question in the theory of moral sentiments, that Smith sees not a fixed wisdom of the past, he sees an evolving, a changing, improving set of moral sentiments, but there's still a kind of red light, green light that we learn from a very young age, and our desire for approval is the means by which this can be policed. So the reason why we need to use disapproval in the education of young people, not to say you can do anything you can as long as it's not illegal, anything you want as long as it's not illegal, is that the innate human desire for approval will mean that instances of disapproval for bad, that is just immoral, not illegal behavior, will cause people to internalize these views. And they can change, they can evolve. They evolve like any kind of evolutionary system. And so I think the answer really is in theory of moral sentiments, and it is a mischaracterization of conservatism to say it has a fixed set of ideas. What it has is an emergent set of ideas, but this emergent comes from a consistent set of underlying values. And so long as we recognize that in gatherings like this, we argue about what the correct rules are, we can make progress. We don't have to accept either of the two positions. If it's not illegal, it must be moral, or there's a fixed set of rules that were established in the 1300s.
Yeah, and so we might add on to that something like Chesterton's fence, right? As a way to kind of check moving faster than what the actual evidence suggests.
So if this were the Econ Talk drinking game, everybody would have to drink because Chesterton fence was just mentioned.
I was going to say Bayesian updating too, and that would make us have to drink, right? All right. So I think we've kind of talked about the importance of freedom and the importance of virtue in markets, but I do want to kind of go beyond the philosophical, which I know is a great thing at an ISI conference. But I do want to talk a little bit about policy coming up here, which is the kind of future of the American economy, both in terms of the American economies, as Tom might put it, in terms of the 50 American economies that we have, but also at the national level. So, I'll ask all three of you, where do you think that the American economy is going? And I'm not asking you to make predictions about the stock market, but what are the biggest challenges ahead that we're going to need to wrestle with, and what role should government play or not play as the American economy, speaking of evolution, evolves and emerges? Sam?
Well, I wrote a book on this subject.
That's why I asked you.
There are a few subjects you've not written a book on.
So I do think that America, like most Western countries, is faced essentially with a type of crossroads right now. And the crossroads is whether we head down the path of interventionism, economic nationalism, a return to, or a deeper embrace of what you might call neo-Keynesian macro arrangements, growing welfare states, growing entitlement problems, as well as all the unpleasant and destructive political dynamics that go along with that. So I worry about Tocqueville's soft despotism problem, right? So we give over more and more of our freedom, and in return for which the government takes care of us. The problem with that is, Margaret Thatcher said, eventually you run out of other people's money, right? So I actually think some of those deeper cultural things are things that I very much worry about. But it doesn't have to be like that. There have been occasions in history when societies have made conscious decisions to shift their economies in very different directions. And I think that happened in the 1980s with the United States, with Britain, but also in many cases, countries that were led by center-left governments that realized they actually had no choice. They just couldn't keep living as if it was 1955 and St. John Maynard Keynes was in heaven and everything was wonderful. So I do think that that's the basic choice we have to make. We have to make a choice between what I'll call state capitalism, which means you have private property, you have markets, you have exchange and all these things, but the government has a very, very heavy role at the macro level and at the micro level. Or you move back in a direction whereby you say, no, we actually want a dynamic, open, competitive, entrepreneurial economy in which government does what government has to do in those economies, rather than doing things that it's spectacularly bad at doing. So once you have that sort of paradigm in your head, I think the policy solutions to a certain extent start to flow from that. It means things like, if you want to go down the free market path, it means deregulation, it means winding back the welfare state, it means doing something about entitlements, it means changing people's expectations about what the state should be doing in the economy, which I think is even harder than a policy change. It also means adopting very positive views about creativity. It also means moving away from a contentment with the status quo, or just being satisfied with what is here and now, and realizing, no, we can do a lot of very good and creative things that produce a lot of wealth, but also in doing so, provide opportunities for people to pursue flourishing in ways that's much harder to do under conditions of state capitalism. And with the state capitalism thing, I also think there's a serious danger of lapsing into corporatism, which I think is very characteristic of Western European economies, but we see it here as well. And corporatism is government and big business and big unions and anything that's big, all just working together and blocking out competitors, making it hard for people to advance up the economic chain, making everything dependent upon who you know in the government rather than your own entrepreneurial efforts. So I think that's the basic choice that we're facing. And what's interesting at the moment is I don't see anyone on the political stage, any government in the world, except maybe Argentina, where there is any political leader of any stature making a very strong case for the market approach. I don't see anyone like that. That's very different from what it was like 20 years ago. We see lots of people proposing different forms of economic nationalism, even with President-elect Trump. If you look at his policies, depending on what speech he gave and what time and who he was talking to, it's a mishmash of different things. There are some free market ideas there, but there's also some pretty economic nationalist stuff going on as well. So that's, I think, the basic sort of paradigm choice that we need to make, and everything else flows from that.
Tom?
So when looking at the future, and when you think about government debt, people often talk about the national debt, Social Security, Medicare, those unfunded obligations. But at the state and local level, they've racked up billions of dollars of their own debt and unfunded liabilities. And I worry that, as these things grow and grow, and people are voting with their feet, particularly a state like Illinois, states like New York, like California, they are going to run out of other people's money. And as we saw in 2020 with the massive amount of federal transfers to the states, It was that urge, that knee-jerk reaction to, try to protect everyone from any possible risk. But at the end of the day, all those transfers did was enable bad behavior. You look at, the money Illinois received, whether it was from the Standard CARES Act stuff or from the Federal Reserve purchasing their municipal debt, which was, the Federal Reserve buying municipal bonds. That was the first time that had ever happened in the Fed's history. But strangely enough, those Federal Reserve loans came with no terms and conditions. And so it just enabled Illinois to keep doing what they're doing, keep racking up debt. And, the kind of corruption that goes on in Illinois would make it'd make a Soviet bureaucrat blush. And so that moral element, it enables bad behavior. So when these states start to experience serious fiscal stress, we'll come to a crossroads where will the federal government bail them out and enable that bad behavior? Or will they let them fail? And then out of that, and you look at previous fiscal crises in American history, thinking specifically of the canal bubble in the 1830s, 1840s, citizens were so fed up with how irresponsibly state governments spent, that crisis actually spurred many of the first balanced budget amendments. So with that crisis, you do get with that failure, you get the approbation of citizens, the approbation of voters, and hopefully the institutional constraints to rein in government.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about when they're going to start asking for exit taxes in these states because they are in these death spirals. And I was appalled to learn when I went to Switzerland a few years ago that they have something like this, a claim on you as a citizen of a state. Yeah, I'm very much worried about this too. I think the concept of moral hazard in economics is so critical to understanding so much of the world around us, including this area, but even foreign policy, right? In terms of things like buck passing, free riding, reckless driving, we see that at the state level, we see that in the international level. So
Can I say something about what Tom said about the crisis?
Yeah.
So I always think of Rahm Emanuel, that great statesman, and his line, never let a crisis go to waste, right? So we had the financial crisis. What do we get? Obamacare, right? But what's interesting about crises is that things can go well in the way that Tom just described. And in the 1970s, governments around the world acted in the right way in response to serious economic crises and problems that were shaping all Western economies. But governments don't always do that. Sometimes they make decisions that make things actually worse. So I'm always nervous when there's a crisis because the chances of governments doing the right thing, it's 50-50 at best.
Mike, the bigger question.
I would want to channel my good friend Peter Boettke from George Mason University. His claim is that we should think of the progress of societies as a dynamic, even dialectic process among three forces: the good, the bad, and the stupid. So the good, for the most part, is market processes because that's where growth, innovation comes from, and a lot of it comes from division of labor. We don't understand the degree to which division of labor can be elaborated in different countries. The United States is big enough that we can elaborate division of labor within the United States, and as a result, we're constantly getting new industries. And so some industries, as they mature, become more and more dependent on the bad, which is politics. Having politics as a way of bailing out, protecting us from risk is almost inevitable, but as long as we have new dynamic industries that are coming online, we can stay ahead of that. And of course, the stupid is bureaucracy. The accretion of bureaucracy over time are like barnacles on the hull of a ship. And the barnacles add weight, they slow things down, but they don't really do anything for the ship. Now, whether these barnacles are painted red or blue doesn't matter. You need to scrape them off, but it's very difficult to do. Mansur Olson said can only be done by war, in fact. So it's difficult for politics ever to get rid of bureaucracy. Now, the thing is that this contest between the good, the bad, and the stupid is going to happen, and the reason it's dialectical is that it happens in different ways at different points in time. few years ago, I would have said that there were just two basket cases in South America, Venezuela and Argentina, both of which had been taken over by the bad and the stupid. There was very little opportunity for the good to do anything. But look what has happened in Argentina. There has been a breakout of the good, and actually the energy that is potentially available there should not be underestimated. So we should take heart. And in Argentina, of all places, it was possible for the good still to break out, to scrape a lot of the barnacles off, for the politicians to lose to a remarkably radical political agenda if things are bad enough. And so I would say that in the United States, the bad and the stupid have been making very big progress lately. We shouldn't forget that the good has done pretty well. We have a lot of new industries. We may be unhappy with the degree of change about them, but the United States still has growth. We still have increases in jobs. And as long as we don't throttle the good too much, I'm hoping that the new administration will be able to make progress in that direction, though it does seem, as Sam said, to be kind of a mixed bag. I don't see anything like the full-throated advocacy of markets that I would have hoped for, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the fact that it seemed like the tax cuts and deregulation were things that were emphasized, that might give us some. And again, you're gonna say like something about tax cuts without spending, or maybe
I used to write for Rush Limbaugh. 2009, 2010, I wrote for Rush Limbaugh. I got him to say several times, U.S. policy is daft, D-A-F-T. Deficits are future taxes.
Yeah.
So a tax cut is actually a tax increase only on future generations. So yes, I'm going to say tax cuts are stupid unless you have spending cuts. Yeah. That's a lie. It's a lie.
What's a lie?
Saying that I'm cutting taxes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have to have the spending cuts.
You don't cut spending. All you're doing is taxing future generations.
Right. No, and that's why I have some pessimism because of the fact that your example of Argentina, I think, was meant to give optimism. I took pessimism, right? Which is that...
Well, you would.
Yeah. But that there's a lot of ruin in a nation, and there's a lot of ruin in bad policies. You can go a long time, like with those barnacles, before it sinks the ship. And my worry is that we won't actually change the course of where we're headed until we're actually going over the cliff. And that's what happened in Argentina.
That's a mixed metaphor.
Yeah, sorry. But Argentina was failing, and it had to fail before it could get there. I don't want to have to fail first. Is there a hope that we could have a Thatcher before we actually get to failure?
We have a Trump. Let's see. Maybe it'll work.
Yeah.
My concern with what you just described, Will, is that Americans historically love tax cuts, right? It's sort of built into American DNA, in which I think is very different from virtually any other country. But what worries me is that there is no major politician today who is saying things like, we need to seriously address entitlements. Entitlements have become one of those rails you're not allowed to touch. So President-elect Trump has made it very clear he is not touching any of those things. And the problem with that is where the bulk of federal government spending is. That is what is driving our debt. So this is sort of to Mike's point that, yes, tax cuts are great, but you also need the spending cuts to go with them. And I see no willingness across the political spectrum to deal with that second part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could try to convince, Republicans that we have to kill some of these bureaucracies, and that's the mechanism for some of the costs.
And of course, the response of the left will be, well, one, you're Nazis, obviously.
Want less government, you're a Nazi, right?
But also, you're Paul Ryan pushing grandma off the cliffs.
Yeah,
right.
No, and I would say that there's one person I want to give kudos to on this, which was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen. When he was the chairman, he was asked, what is America's greatest national security threat? And I expected him to say China, terrorism, Iran, the litany of, the axis of evil, so to speak. But he actually said it was our national debt and deficits. And I think that it was heartening to hear someone in that position say that. Now, again, part of that is because he didn't want to see the defense budget probably cut, and he knew that our economy is actually the golden goose. But that itself is an amount of economic mastery that most people in Washington don't have, particularly at the Pentagon, which is like, as Jim Antle said, an honorary member of the private sector, according to Republicans. And but I liked seeing that, and so I do think that it's an important for people on the conservative side of the spectrum to kind of continue to harp on this issue, because I do think that we have a moral responsibility not to do what Mike said, not what he did, what he said, which is to essentially just be taxing people who have no representation today, right? The young people and the unborn. And so I think that's going to be important. Let's wrap up here because we only have a couple minutes left. And Sam, you recommended this question to us. And so let's go kind of rapid fire here, which is, and it's a little bit of fun. Assuming what you could propose is constitutional, because we believe in the rule of law and constitutionalism. But if you had Congress, the executive branch, on your side, what would be the economic reform that you would most highlight or promote to advance our economic prosperity ahead?
Just one?
I'm just going to say one because we're at
okay. So
10:28.
So rapid fire would be serious simplification of the tax code. We have one of the most ridiculously complicated tax codes in the world, and that is a major impediment to growth, to distorts and corrupts incentives, etc. So that's one thing. The second thing is one I've already mentioned, which is the entitlement problem. I worry not just about the economics of that, I also worry about the cultural dimension of that. That's actually what worries me more than, in some respects, than the economics. But also, I think tackling the regulatory state is a huge one. If you think about the Federal Code of Regulations, what is it, 110,000 pages now? I suspect it's even more. So those three things are huge problems that are facing the American economy right now and would require enormous expenditures of political capital. But I don't see how we get back to what we're supposed to be about without at least one of those things happening.
Tom?
Oh, I think, thinking about it, if it's a constitutional rule, I would want to see a combination of a fiscal and a monetary rule. Something that constrains taxes and spending to, say the sum of population plus inflation, like the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights out in Colorado, and then that monetary rule to make sure that Washington then doesn't try to use the money printer. Now, of course, that doesn't fix everything. It doesn't fix the regulatory state, like Sam mentioned. I've also become amicable to the idea of a, sort of BRAC commission, but for the entire government, which gets around the incentive problem because it requires silent approval. Instead of voicing your support for a spending cut, you voice your support to stop a spending cut, but otherwise, you're quiet on it. They say, we're going to cut these things and speak now or forever hold your peace.
Mike?
My Duke colleagues are big fans of the countries of Northern Europe, which they think are utopias. All of those have national sales taxes. So a national sales tax, at least in part, to displace some of the income tax. If you want to have income taxes, let's have a national sales tax. Let's make a credible commitment at entitlement reform. I believe that if we do that, it will settle financial markets and cause a big increase in growth, because it means that we're going to be able to continue to sell long-term bonds. If we don't do those things, if we don't make some commitment to increased revenue and reduced spending, the interest rate that we're going to have to pay on long-term bonds is going to start to go up to the point where almost all discretionary spending is going to be displaced by interest on the debt. We're almost there now. Interest on the debt is the single largest, outside of the entitlements, part of the budget. So we're verging on the point where we're going to lose the ability to address this problem. We're going to pass the point of no return. In fact, some people, when they hear about this, they throw things.
Yeah. I mean, if that happens, would that actually prove Friedman's starve the beast hypothesis, though? We'll leave that. I don't like that prospect either. I would just take the chair's privilege and say that there were two things I would say that are non-economic that would, in the specific sense, that would improve our future economic health. One would be school choice, because I think our educational system is entirely broken, and that puts a much lower ceiling on our potential future.
North Carolina has that now, so you should all be like us.
No, and I think this is an area where there's a lot of policy optimism at the state level. And then the second, and this is entirely predictable, I would say, is we have to have a better foreign policy, because I think this is a drag on our future, not just in the obvious ways, but also in the ways that it actually harms and enervates, I think, our kind of our society and our kind of, if you will, our kind of social power. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you to my guests. Thanks, everyone. Give them a hand.
Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and feel free to check out one of the recommended videos.